Good morning, everybody. My name is David Sorn. I am the lead pastor here at Renovation Church. Morning to you. I don't know about you, but I find that it's often easier to look at someone else's life with a broadened perspective. Like you can look at them and say, hey, I see that you're really struggling with school right now and it's really hard, but listen, someday it's all going to pay off and it's going to be worth it. Or if someone's gone through a tough breakup, you can say, hey, you know what? God's going to use this. He's going to lead you to the right person. And you know what? He's bringing you closer to him through this trial. We tend to look with a decently broad perspective when we're assessing someone else's life. But when our life gets difficult, for a lot of us, we just go right into tunnel vision. Okay, we say, God, what do you think you're doing right now? What in the world is going on? Why do you have me here of all places? And what do you want me to do in this hard place? And yet, even if you're in that hard place right now, one of the things I so desperately want you to hear today is that God has a plan. And God has you where he has you for a reason. And we're going to see that in the Word of God this morning as we continue with our summer series on the amazing book of Esther. So go ahead and grab a Bible, whether you brought one with you. If not, encourage everybody to grab one at the chair so you can see it and read the story with your own eyes. We're going to be on page 342 in our church Bibles. As you're finding that, let me catch you up to speed if you've been out of town a bit, or maybe it's your first time here this morning. Welcome to you. Happy you're here. So the book of Esther starts in the year 483 BC in the city of Susa, which is in the kingdom of Persia. Susa is in kind of like modern-day Iran. And the Persian king Xerxes has gotten rid of his wife, and he decided that he was going to get a new wife, and he was going to pick the most beautiful girl in all the land of Persia, and he ends up surprisingly picking the Jewish orphan exile Esther to become the next queen of Persia, except nobody knows that she is Jewish at this point. And then 2 weeks ago, when we were last in Esther, we read about the villain, Haman, and how much he hated Esther's cousin, Mordecai. In fact, Haman hated Mordecai so much that he convinced King Xerxes to issue a decree to kill not just Mordecai, but all of the Jewish people throughout the kingdom. So we're going to join the story there. So we're starting right at the beginning of chapter 4. So all you need to do is find the big number 4 on that page, and you will be in the right spot. Okay, here's what it says. It says, when Mordecai learned of all that had been done, so the decree that had gone out that the Jews were going to die, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the edict and the order of he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. Okay, let's pause there for a second. So when Mordecai learns that the Jews are basically virtually going to be wiped out, he tears his clothes and he begins to put on the scratchy sackcloth and ashes on his head. Now, this is typical mourning procedure for a Jewish person. But when Esther hears that Mordecai is acting like this, honestly, she's a little bit embarrassed, and she sends him some regular clothes to put on instead. Now, obviously, Esther has not heard yet about the edict that is going to wipe out all of the Jews. Okay, so let's keep reading. So verse 6, so just find the small 6. Okay, verse 6. It says, so Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death. unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. Okay, and so what Esther is saying, she's saying, Mordecai, what you're asking me to do is not an easy thing. Basically, if I go into the king uninvited, the law is that I'm to be put to death. Unless for some odd reason he's going to have mercy on me. You can almost hear the queen Esther saying to Mordecai, do you not remember what happened to the last Queen Vashti, when she was bold to the king? It didn't work out so well, right? And she's saying, besides, I haven't even seen the king in 30 days. So for all I know, he's already super mad at me. And now you're asking me to put my life at risk. And Mordecai is going to essentially tell her that because she's a Jew, her life is already at risk. Okay, let's keep reading. So verse 12. Verse 12, it says this. It says, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Okay, let's sit here for a little bit because I think we've come to what is sort of the essential question of this biblical text, and that is this. Many of us at different times in our lives are going to wrestle with, what should I do when I get in a really hard or really complex or really difficult situation in my life? Like, what does God want me to do? And here's the first principle that I think we can pull from this text. Number one, my friend, trust in God's plan. So when Mordecai utters what really is the most famous line of the book of Esther, and he says, perhaps you've come to your royal position for such a time as this, he's alluding to God's plan. He's saying, Esther, okay, just stop and think about it. I know that things look really bleak right now. I mean, they basically just issued they're going to commit genocide against our people. But just think about it. You're an exile. You're a Jewish exile. You're an orphan Jewish exile, and you've been somehow elevated to queen of the most powerful nation on earth. I don't know, maybe God's doing something here. And yet there's still a humility, right? Because if you look at the beginning of that verse 14, he actually still says, who knows? Maybe you've come to your position for such a time as this. And he says, who knows? Because honestly, we never get a full picture of God's plan. We just don't. Now think of it this way. Okay, let's look at this back wall right here. I want you to imagine this black back wall is like a full picture or storyboard of your entire life and all the different other lives and stories and plans that intersect with your life. Okay, that's a lot. Now, how much of that do you see and do you understand? I would say realistically, we see about this much of the story. That's it. That's what you get to see. All of this is going on. You see this. And this is why it's so important that if there is a God, and there is a good God who is in control, if you're going to live with wisdom, it is important that you trust that he knows what's happening. And that he has a plan. And that he has a good plan. Because the truth is, every single person in this room is going to have a moment, or two, or three, where you are going to be tested, like Esther. You're going to be tested at work, or maybe in your family, or maybe with your health, and the decision that you make is going to reveal how much you actually do trust God. And when you get there, or for some of you, if you are there right now, I just want to say to you so deeply, trust in God. Trust in his plan. Because listen, if Esther would have said, no, Mordecai, I don't want to do that. If she was so locked in on all she could see, right, she would have said no. She said, I don't want to do that. That's going to affect me negatively. That's not in my best interest. And then her story wouldn't be an inspiration to any of us, right? Because she's not trusting beyond what she can see, but she did trust beyond what she could see. She trusted God had a plan. Listen, God is not surprised by anything that's happening in your life right now. He has a plan, and he has you where he has you for a reason. Okay, let me pull out a second principle from this biblical text. What should you do in a complex, a hard, a difficult situation? Number 2, it is so important to remember, even in the hard situations, you have a purpose. I actually think this is really important for our culture today. So God obviously has a really specific purpose in getting Esther up into the palace, right? And this is important for us to know today because I think there are so many people in American culture that don't feel like they have a purpose. And that's because our broader secular culture never speaks to purpose anymore. It mostly just speaks about trivial things, right? Like how do you find pleasure? How do you make more money? How do you determine and find your authentic self, right? And I'm sure that's all interesting, but listen, you are wired to find out the deeper questions of life. Like how did we get here? And why are you here? And what's the purpose of your life? This is why I think it's so good to follow God, and I love his word, because it, unlike the secular culture out there, it gives answers to all of those things. You can find truth and answers, and it tells you that God created the world, and God created you, so you could have a relationship with him. And in fact, God has a very specific purpose for your life. And we see that truth in Esther. That's what this chapter is about. She is on the throne for such a time as this, to save the Jews. That's the purpose of her life. And for some of you, I think it's so critical that you internalize this biblical truth. God has you where he has you for such a time as this. For some of you in this room, God has you retired right now for such a time as this. Not just to sit around and travel for the next 15 years, but to be used by God as a leader, to disciple young people, to lead, to evangelize. He has you here for such a time as this. You know, for some of you, God has you in your school or at your workplace, even if you're like, I don't want to go there tomorrow, for such a time as this. He has you in your neighborhood for such a time as this. Okay, so that's 2 principles. The third one I'm going to pull out of our next section. So let's actually go back to the Bible, and we were at verse 15. So find the small 15, and then we're going to go a little bit into chapter 5. Okay, verse 15. It says, Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. So she's telling them to pray. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. On the 3rd day, by the way, lots of things in the Bible happen on the 3rd day. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given you. If it pleases the king, replied Esther, let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. Bring Haman at once, the king said, so that we may do what Esther asks. So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, Now what is your petition? It will be given you, and what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Esther replied, My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. Now, we don't actually know for sure why Esther delays it until the next day. Some scholars think that she just got too nervous at the first banquet. Some believe it was highly intentional. You know, it's a relational culture, and so there's a lot of relating that has to do before you make a big ask. Either way, let me just do a spoiler alert here. She is going to ask him to save her people, the Jews. And out of this boldness, I believe we see a third principle about what do we do when you get in really complex, sticky, hard situations, and that is principle number 3. We are to obey our God no matter what. Because this is Esther, right? What did verse 16 say in chapter 4? She says, even though it's against the law, I'll go. And if I perish, I perish. And she's not being overly dramatic, okay? Like, her life is significantly at risk here. And I don't know how you first read this text. Maybe you even questioned Esther a little bit, like, really? When she first started talking to Mordecai, remember, she's like, everybody knows that if you go to the king, you're going to die. But I don't know if it's just me or what. I love to play out all the different scenarios, but I've always empathized with Esther. Like, I know that there are some people in the Bible that they just leap in first thing and they do the right thing. But when I read Esther, she reminds me that we're human. And let's just be real. Typically, it's not easy to just obey God no matter the cost. I know there are some people that just say, oh, obey God, it's easy or whatever. That's not what this church is, okay? We're telling the truth. Sometimes it's really hard to obey God. Because you're like Esther, you're counting the cost. And you're going, I could die. I could die. But I love Esther because she's not a robot, she's human. And she's scared for her life. And yet, eventually, she obeys anyway, despite her fears. And I love that. It reminds me of one of my favorite books, which is The Silver Chair. The Silver Chair is the fourth book that C.S. Lewis wrote in the Chronicles of Narnia. By the way, you can find the Chronicles of Narnia in our amazing Christian library that we have just down the adult wing hall to the left. We have several copies of each of the books. Go check it out today. But The Silver Chair is an amazing book, not just for kids, but also, I think, even more so for adults. And in the book, if you've never read it, the children in the book are given these 4 signs or instructions from Aslan, who's kind of the Jesus figure in the book. And the signs are meant to help them find the lost prince of Narnia, Prince Rilian. And the signs are meant to be symbolic of God's word, of the Bible. And so the children are told they need to memorize the signs so that when they come upon the signs, that they can actually obey them. And then Aslan tells Jill, one of the girls, he says, the 4th and final sign is this. He says, you'll know that you've actually found the lost prince, and that in that he will be the very first person that you meet in all of your travels that will ask you to do something in my name, in the name of Aslan. That's how you know you finally found the lost prince. And the children go about their journey all throughout the land trying to find the lost prince. And as they go about their journey, they find out that interpreting the signs isn't as easy as they thought. And so therefore obeying them is sometimes harder than they thought. And nowhere is this more clear than the 4th sign. So eventually they come upon this man, and eventually this man is bound and he's shackled to this mysterious silver chair. But the man seems very dangerous, right? And a little bit just unpredictable and crazy. And he claims that he's been put under this spell, and he's just screaming and yelling, and the children are very, very scared. And while he's yelling, he says to them, in the name of Aslan, set me free. And the kids look at each other and they say, isn't that the 4th sign? But could that be the prince? What do we do? And I want to read you what C.S. Lewis writes here. I actually brought my own copy of The Silver Chair this morning. Okay, here's what he says. It says, oh, if only we knew, said Jill, one of the kids. I think we do know, said Puddleglum, their guide. Do you mean you think everything will come right if we do untie him? I don't know about that, said Puddleglum. You see, Aslan didn't tell us what would happen. He only told us what to do. And see, I actually think this is really important. Because you may be at a situation at work right now, or maybe with your extended family, and you know that something is wrong, it's not right, it's unethical, someone's going the wrong way, and you know and you can feel the Spirit guiding you in your heart that you need to speak up. But you also kind of internally can feel that if you speak up, it may not go well for you. It might cost you. And a lot of times we feel like the kids in the book who say, hey, if we do this, will that make everything right? And what we read from C.S. Lewis is that God doesn't promise us that. He only tells us what we're supposed to do. And I think that one of the reasons that American Christians today have such a hard time obeying God when life is hard is because we've wrongly linked together obedience and earthly blessing. And we believe this false teaching that says, if I obey God, he will bless me. Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe that's not his plan. Now, I believe in heavenly blessing. But obedience doesn't always lead to earthly blessing. We, as Christ followers, all we know is that we're just called to obey. But listen, you look at the book of Esther, and if Esther is only interested in obedience if it's going to make her life better, she's never going in to see the king. And she's going to miss out on God's purpose because she's wrongly understood what obedience is. That's why she says, if I perish, I perish. Because obedience is when you obey because God is the king. And honestly, my friends, let's just be biblical here. God is the king, and we are his servants. And we're living in his story, in his creation, for his glory. But what's happened, I think, often in American Christianity is we've begun somehow, maybe in our self-centeredness, to completely invert the biblical story. And before you know it, it's easy to live like God is your servant, and he's living as a character in your story whose mission it is to bring about your purposes and your desires. But when you live like that, it is so hard to obey God, and you'll almost never obey him when it's difficult. But when you live in biblical truth, what happens is you remember that actually, this is quite amazing, because you get to fulfill a mission for the creator of the universe. Well, I don't know about you, I think that's pretty amazing. You actually have the honor, you have the privilege of serving the purposes of the King of Kings. That's incredible. And see, that begins to change your thinking, it begins to change your action, and it allows you to look at even some of the hardest moments of your life and say, perhaps God has brought me to this moment for such a time as this. Amen.